He offered his jacket to a woman shivering at the bus stop, unaware that she was a CEO who would change his life forever. The wind sliced through New York with sharp precision, while snow gently descended from the overcast sky, coating the streets and muffling the usual city noise. At a nearly empty bus stop beneath a flickering streetlight, Henry stood, hunched over in a worn olive jacket, clutching a tattered manila folder tightly to his chest. Inside the folder were 5 resumes, each bearing a silent rejection. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath form a mist in the crisp night air. 46 years old, a former construction engineer, widower, father, and for the time being, homeless. The weight of it all pressed down on him, as heavy as the snow accumulating at his feet. The nearby pharmacy's sign blinked 8:41 p.m. The bus was late. Cold seeped through his worn boots, creeping up his legs. Then, through the snow, a woman appeared. She looked to be in her 30s, dressed in a business skirt and blouse, with no coat and heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her damp hair clung to her face, and her arms were tightly wrapped around herself. She stopped beneath the same awning, breathing heavily, hands shaking. Henry tried not to stare, but her presence caught him off guard. She was striking, clean, polished, yet clearly struggling against the cold. She rubbed her bare hands together in a futile attempt to warm them. He looked away. Just another night. Just another bus to nowhere. But then the wind howled. She flinched, curling inward, and Henry glanced at her again. His jacket wasn't much, but it was something. He could keep it, stay silent, and blend into the background like everyone else. But he didn't. Without a word, he shrugged off the coat. The cold bit deep. He stepped toward her and extended the jacket. Startled, she said, "You don't have to do that." Henry gave her a weary smile. "I've already lost enough today. This coat, it's the only thing I have left to give." She hesitated. "But you need it more than I do." Still, he gently draped it over her shoulders. "Not tonight." The warmth took her by surprise. It smelled faintly of soap, maybe coffee, a quiet comfort. She instinctively pulled it tighter around herself. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, folding his arms to keep warm. They stood in silence as the snow continued to fall. After a moment, she turned to him. "What's your name?" she asked. "Henry." "I'm Claire." "Nice to meet you, Claire." She glanced at him again. "You shouldn't have given me your jacket." He smiled faintly. "Probably not, but I couldn't just let you freeze." The sound of an approaching bus broke the silence, its headlights cutting through the snow as it pulled up. Claire moved toward it, then paused and turned back. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked. Henry shrugged. "Somewhere," he said, though he didn't explain that it was the back seat of a rusted truck parked behind a warehouse. She reached into her purse and handed him a card. "In case you ever need anything." He took it, slipping it into his folder without a glance. He didn't expect to use it. People said things like that all the time, but most didn't mean it. Claire stepped onto the bus, glancing back once more, the coat wrapped around her like armor. Henry watched until the bus disappeared into the snow. Alone again, he stood shivering, not from the cold, but from something else, something small, quiet, and powerful. He looked up at the sky, then down at the empty street. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered, before turning and walking into the night. Henry walked slowly through the quiet back streets, the snow crunching beneath his worn shoes. There was no need to hurry, no one waiting, no lights left on in any window, just the cold familiarity of his truck parked behind an old warehouse on the edge of the city. He reached it just after 9. The old '98 Chevy was rusted, its heater long dead. Inside the front seat was a nest of blankets, a pillow in the corner, and a lunchbox tucked beneath the dashboard. He climbed in, shut the door, and sat in silence. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a small tin box and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph. His wife, Lily, smiling brightly, and their son, Noah, around 7, grinning crookedly. "Good night, Lily," Henry whispered. "Good night, Noah." He leaned back, his eyes on the ceiling, letting memories wash over him. He had once been Henry Miles, a structural engineer. He built things, schools, homes, hospitals. He had a wife who taught kindergarten and laughed often, even when life was hard. Their son had her laugh, joyful and unfiltered. They weren't rich, but they were content. Then the cancer came. By the time they found it, it was already stage 4. Lily was gone in 9 months. Henry left his job to care for her. Afterward, everything unraveled. Bills piled up, savings drained. He sold the house, moved with Noah into smaller and smaller spaces until there was nothing left but the truck. Still, he tried to shield his son. He turned the back seat into a spaceship, canned soup into adventures, and a parking lot into their backyard. Every morning he walked Noah to school, clean-shaven and with his shirt tucked in. "Why do you still cut your hair?" a shelter worker had once asked. Henry smiled. "Because my son needs to believe things can get better, and I need to look like I believe that too." He worked whatever jobs he could find, moving furniture, fixing gutters, sweeping construction sites. It wasn't enough, but it kept them together until last fall. A social worker stepped in, said it wasn't safe, said Noah needed stability. Henry didn't argue. He knew they were right. Through blurry eyes, he signed the papers, hugged his son, and promised, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been a climb. He sent resumes, stood in job fair lines, took notes at free workshops, and studied codes at the library. He was building a plan, slowly, quietly. Tonight had made that plan feel farther than ever as he sat alone in his cold truck, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He pulled the blanket over himself for warmth, thoughts of Clare, the woman at the bus stop, drifting through his mind. He remembered how cold she had looked, how surprised she seemed when he offered her his coat. He wasn't sure why he had done it. Maybe it was because she reminded him of Lily. Or maybe he just needed to feel that he could still do something good, that he was still the kind of man who gave more than he took. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Henry pulled the blanket tighter around himself, leaning against the cold window, and closed his eyes. He didn't have much, but he still had himself, and for now, that would have to be enough. Claire stepped into the warm lobby of her apartment building, the warmth enveloping her like a comforting embrace. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod, but she barely acknowledged him. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator, still wrapped tightly in the jacket the stranger had given her. She hadn't intended to accept it. In fact, she had tried to refuse, but the man, Henry, had insisted, his quiet determination in his eyes stopping any further protest. Now the jacket hung awkwardly on her, too large and worn, but warmer than anything she had worn in years. She stepped into her penthouse on the 28th floor and was greeted by the silence of her home. No television, no music, no laughter, just the hum of modern appliances and the distant howl of the winter wind outside the thick glass windows. Claire dropped her purse onto the entryway table and slowly peeled off the jacket. Just as she was about to set it aside, her fingers brushed something in the inner pocket. Curiosity piqued, she reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn, creased at the corners, and smudged with fingerprints and time. She unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. 2 stick figures stood hand in hand under a crooked sun. One was labeled Dad, the other Me. A small heart floated between them, and at the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "I love you, Daddy. Noah." Claire stood frozen. She stared at the drawing, the words blurring before her eyes. A tremor ran through her, and she sank onto the edge of her couch, the jacket still in one hand and the picture in the other. Her throat tightened. Noah. The name lodged in her mind like a thorn. The way Henry had held the folder, the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight in his voice, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a man who had given her his coat. This was a father who still carried a piece of his child close to his heart. A father who had nothing, yet still chose to give. She looked around her apartment. It was immaculate. High ceilings, designer furniture, glass walls, nothing personal, nothing that spoke of warmth. It was a space designed for success, not for comfort. Claire folded the drawing gently and placed it on her lap. Then, without thinking, she pulled the coat close and hugged it tightly to her chest. It still smelled faintly of something familiar. Maybe laundry detergent, maybe a memory. And suddenly, without warning, tears welled up in her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. Not really. Not since she was a little girl, cold and hungry, sitting on the steps of her church, hoping someone would notice her. That night, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face. He had taken off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He hadn't said much, just smiled and told her she'd be okay. It had been the first act of kindness she could remember, the first time she'd felt seen. She never saw the man again, but that moment changed everything. Claire sniffed and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. She wasn't that same girl anymore. She had clawed her way out of the foster system, worked through college on scholarships and sheer determination, and built Infinity Group from a single app idea into one of the most influential tech companies on the East Coast. She had earned every dollar, every accolade. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it meant to need, what it meant to give. Tonight, a stranger had reminded her. She looked again at the drawing, at the shaky little heart between the stick figures, then at the coat in her arms, too big, too worn, but heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Langston cried, not because she was broken, but because something inside her had been gently, beautifully cracked open. The next morning, Claire sat at her desk, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, but her eyes were fixed on the crumpled drawing in her hand. The edges were worn now from being unfolded and folded again, as though she were trying to memorize every stroke of crayon. She had barely slept. She kept replaying the night before, the way Henry had offered his only coat without hesitation, the quiet dignity in his voice, the pain behind his tired smile. Something about him haunted her. Not just the kindness, but the sorrow he tried so hard to hide. She reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a small silver bell. Moments later, her assistant Rachel stepped in. "Yes, Miss Langston?" "I need you to help me find someone," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. Rachel blinked. "Of course. Who?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second. "His name is Henry. I don't have a last name. He was at the 56th and Madison bus stop last night around 8:30. He gave me his jacket. I want to find him." Rachel looked surprised, but she nodded. "I'll see what I can do. And Rachel, this stays between us." Over the next few days, Claire's instructions were carried out with quiet efficiency. Her team, used to locating elusive developers and poached executives, now turned their skills toward piecing together the life of a man who lived in the shadows. They pulled traffic camera footage from nearby intersections briefly captured Henry's figure, blurred and bundled up in his jacket. They traced the bus routes that stopped in the area around the time Claire had boarded. By cross-referencing entry logs, they narrowed down a handful of potential riders. None of them matched corporate databases. Finally, Rachel returned with a thin folder. "His name is Henry Miles," she said. Used to be a structural engineer. No recent employment records. I found some online forum posts asking about job openings. He listed a contact number linked to a prepaid phone. No permanent address. Claire flipped through the pages. An old driver's license photo, a LinkedIn profile frozen in time, a scan of a construction license long expired. No arrest records, no scandals, just absence. Claire closed the folder, the silence in the room hanging heavily. "Where is he now?" she asked. Rachel shifted, her voice careful. "One of our guys spotted him yesterday near the south end of the Bronx. There's an old pickup truck parked behind a warehouse. He's been seen coming and going, sleeping in it." Claire stood, her decision firm. "I want to go there." Rachel hesitated. "Claire, are you sure? We could arrange for someone to approach him or bring him here." "No," Claire interrupted. "This isn't a meeting. It's personal." Rachel said nothing, but her eyes softened. "I'll have someone drive you." An hour later, Claire sat in the back of a black sedan, watching the cityscape change as they passed streets far removed from boardrooms and glass towers. They drove past shuttered storefronts, graffiti-covered walls, and people moving with their heads down against the cold. The driver pulled up near the warehouse. Claire saw it immediately. An old Chevy tucked into the shadows, snow piled around its tires. It looked like it hadn't moved in days. She stepped out into the chill. The air smelled like rust and damp concrete. Her heels crunched softly on the gravel as she walked slowly toward the truck. Through the windshield, she could just make out a figure in the front seat. As she got closer, the door creaked open, and Henry stepped out, blinking in the daylight. He looked at her, confusion at first, then recognition, his expression shifting to puzzlement, caution, and finally, something like embarrassment. "Claire," he said, his voice rough with sleep and surprise. She offered a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, Henry." He looked down at himself, his wrinkled clothes, snow-dusted boots, and the truck behind him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," she said simply. He frowned, crossing his arms. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. About the kind of person who gives his only coat to a stranger." Henry gave a bitter laugh. "You didn't have to track me down for that. A thank you card would have done the job." "It's not about thanks," she said. "It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two people from different worlds brought together by an unlikely act in a bitter wind. Finally, Henry exhaled. "You came all this way just for that?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Yes, and maybe something more." The next time Claire saw Henry, he was bent over a stack of cinder blocks at a construction site on the edge of Queens. She had waited in her car for 20 minutes, watching from a distance as he moved steadily, silently, hauling, stacking, lifting in the biting cold, with the quiet resolve of a man used to being overlooked. He wore a worn flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms despite the chill, and his breath puffed out in visible clouds. His hands were calloused, nails dirty, but his movements were precise, efficient, and purposeful. When he took his break and sat on a low wall with a plastic water bottle in hand, Claire stepped out of the car and walked toward him. Henry looked up and did a double take. He stood quickly, brushing dust from his pants. "Claire." "Hi again," she said, her smile small but genuine. "What are you doing here?" he asked. She handed him a cup of coffee she had brought with her. "Thought you might like something warm." He took it hesitantly, his eyes searching hers. "You really didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to." They stood in silence for a beat before she added, "Would you come with me, just for a bit? I'd like to show you something." Henry looked down at his work boots, then back at the foreman in the distance. "I've still got a few hours on shift." "I already spoke to him," Claire said. "Told him you had an interview." His brows raised. "I don't have an interview." "You do now?" she replied. Henry let out a short laugh, more surprised than amused. Okay, let's see what this is about. They drove in silence. Henry glanced out the window, fidgeting occasionally, conscious of his appearance. Dusty jeans, rough hands, the faint trace of sweat on his collar. Claire didn't seem to notice. When they arrived at Infinity Group's downtown headquarters, Henry hesitated in the marble-floored lobby, eyeing the massive glass walls, the polished chrome, the endless buzz of people in suits. I don't belong here, he said under his breath. Claire turned to him. Just come upstairs. They entered a private conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. Claire offered him a seat, then closed the door and sat across from him. Henry cleared his throat. So, what's all this about? Returning the coat? Claire shook her head. No, this isn't about the coat. I kept that. It's mine now. Henry blinked. Okay. She leaned forward. I didn't come to thank you. I came because you made me remember something I forgot, a version of myself I had buried under years of boardrooms and deadlines. You reminded me that real change doesn't always start with innovation or strategy. Sometimes it starts with kindness. Henry looked down. Claire, I'm just a guy trying to survive, and that's exactly why I brought you here. Claire slid a folder across the table to him. Inside was a job proposal, a contract, a new position, cultural and human values advisor. Henry frowned as he flipped through the pages. What is this? He asked. It's a new role, one I created, Claire replied. Someone who sits in on department decisions, training programs, and development discussions, not to talk numbers or strategy, but about people, values, and compassion. You'd share your experiences and help shape the heart of this company. Henry laughed awkwardly, shaking his head. Claire, look at me. I don't have a degree in psychology. I didn't graduate from Harvard. I sleep in a truck. You were an engineer. I haven't built anything in years. You built a moment I'll never forget, Claire said softly. Henry looked away, overwhelmed. This isn't charity, she continued. This is a role only you can fill. You know what it's like to be invisible, to be passed over. And yet, you stopped in the cold and gave your only coat to a stranger. That tells me more about leadership than any resume ever could. He opened his mouth, closed it, then struggled for words. I'm not qualified, he said finally, his voice low. Claire leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. You don't need a degree to teach people how to care because you live it every day. She looked directly into his eyes. You don't need credentials to teach people how to be kind because you've lived it, and that's more powerful than anything you'll ever put on paper. Henry's throat tightened. He stared down at the proposal, then back at her. For the first time in years, he felt something flicker inside him, not fear, not defeat, but hope. Raw, unfamiliar, terrifying hope. Henry sat alone on the bench outside the towering office building, the job proposal resting unread in his lap. His fingers ran along the edges of the folder, but his eyes stared off into the busy street, unfocused. He couldn't do it. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Somewhere deep down he did, but fear gripped him, tight and familiar. The kind that whispered cruel things late at night. She's just being nice. This isn't real. You'll mess it up. You always do. The offer felt like a trap wrapped in kindness. And Henry, who had spent years learning to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true, couldn't shake the weight of doubt. He didn't see Claire step out of the building and walk toward him until she sat beside him in silence. You haven't opened it, she said softly. Henry gave a dry chuckle. Didn't think I needed to. I already know how this ends. Claire tilted her head. How? Someone like me doesn't end up in a place like this. You don't build a company like Infinity by hiring people who sleep in trucks. You think I made you an offer out of pity? She asked. I think I don't belong in your world, Henry muttered. Claire looked ahead for a moment, then stood. Come with me, just for an hour. No suits, no meetings. Just trust me. Against his instincts, Henry stood. They drove in silence for over 30 minutes, away from the city's shining towers and into a quieter part of town. Finally, they pulled up in front of a modest red brick building with a faded green awning. A painted sign read, Thomas's Place, a safe space for every child. Henry followed her inside. The walls were bright, covered in handprints, painted animals, and quotes about kindness. The air smelled faintly of crayons and warm bread. Laughter echoed from down the hall, high, joyous, unfiltered children. Claire led him past a community kitchen, a reading room, and into a wide playroom filled with second-hand toys and handmade posters. Kids of all ages were sprawled across the floor, building puzzles, reading, and playing. This place, Claire said quietly, was named after the man who saved me. Henry looked at her. I grew up in foster homes, bounced around. Some were kind, some weren't. One night I ran away. It was freezing. I was 12. I curled up outside a church, just waiting for morning. She paused, her voice softening. He found me. An old man named Thomas. He gave me his coat, sat with me all night, didn't ask questions, just stayed. Henry didn't speak. He couldn't. I never saw him again, Claire continued. But that moment, it was like someone reached into the darkness and said, You matter. I built this place because of him. She turned to face Henry fully. And last week, someone else gave me a coat. Didn't know who I was. Didn't ask for anything, just gave. Henry swallowed hard. You remind me of him, she said. Not because of what you gave me, but because of who you are. They stood in silence, surrounded by the sounds of life and laughter. Henry's eyes wandered across the room, watching the children play, a volunteer tying a shoelace, a young boy reading aloud with too much energy. It felt warm, real. Claire touched his arm gently. I don't need you to fit in a boardroom, Henry. I need you to remind people of this, of what it means to care. Henry didn't respond, not with words. His eyes were wet now. He looked down, trying to blink them away, but they came anyway. Quiet, unguarded tears. And then he nodded. Not for the job, not for the salary or the title, but because, for the first time in years, he felt it. He was still needed, still useful, still human. Henry stood motionless in the center of a room full of joy and laughter, a single tear trailing down his weathered face, not out of sadness, but from the profound relief of realizing he still mattered. Henry's first day at Infinity Group didn't start with fanfare. There was no welcome party, no press release, just a quiet meeting in a small glass-walled room on the 5th floor with a few skeptical department heads and a stack of sticky notes. Claire had introduced him simply. This is Henry Miles. He's here to help us build something more meaningful than just profit. The looks were polite but uncertain. But Henry didn't flinch. He began by sharing his story. Not the sob, not fully accustomed to the attention, but there was a soft warmth in his eyes. When he reached the stage, Claire extended a hand to him, and he took it, standing beside her. You've changed this place, Henry, Claire said softly. Henry chuckled lightly. No, I just reminded them what they already knew. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. And you reminded me, too. Henry had just finished a workshop on resilience when a young man lingered after the session, the others already filing out. He looked no older than 22, skinny, pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. I just wanted to say something, he said, his voice shaking. Last month I was going to quit. Everything. Life, I mean. I was done. But then I heard you speak, and it stopped me. Henry stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. You said something about how people don't need to be fixed. They just need to be heard. No one had ever said that to me before. It felt like someone finally saw me. The young man swallowed hard. If it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here. Henry's chest tightened, and without a word, he stepped forward and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. I'm really glad you are, he said softly. After the young man left, Henry sat down in his chair, the room suddenly silent. The words echoed in his mind. He had once wondered if he would ever matter again. Now, he had his answer. The atrium of Infinity Group had never looked like this before. Gone were the banners of quarterly achievements and product launches. In their place hung soft white drapes, strings of warm lights, and a massive sign that read in elegant lettering, One Kindness Day. Employees stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their best, not for business, but for something far more meaningful. At the center of the room, Clare Langston stepped up to the podium, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. This day isn't about metrics, she began. It's about moments. The room quieted. A year ago, I was standing at a bus stop in the freezing cold, alone, tired, and more lost than I realized. And then a man, whom I had never met, did something no one else had that night. He gave me his coat. A murmur of recognition stirred through the crowd. Clare smiled softly. It was old, worn, but it was everything because it reminded me that kindness, real kindness, doesn't wait until it's convenient. It shows up when the world least expects it. She turned to the easel beside her and removed the cloth draped over it. There, behind a glass frame, hung the very same coat, frayed at the sleeves, faded from years of use, but preserved like something sacred. Beneath it, engraved on a bronze plaque, were the words, One small act of kindness can rewrite a life. Clare's voice wavered slightly. That act didn't just change my night. It changed the course of my life. And today we honor not just that moment, but the man who made it possible. She turned toward the edge of the stage. Henry, will you come up here? Henry stood slowly from his seat, dressed in a simple suit borrowed from a friend but pressed with care. He made his way through the applause, his face still unsure, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. When he reached the stage, Clare extended her hand to him, and he took it, standing beside her. Lined with time and hardship, now carried something lighter, something peaceful. He stepped up beside her. Clare reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. This belongs to you, she said. Henry opened it. Inside was the title deed to his new house, stamped and official. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Clare leaned in with a smile. No more sleeping in trucks. The room erupted in applause once again, but Henry held up a hand. I actually have something too, he said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled out a small box, simple, worn, clearly held on to for some time. He looked at Clare, his heart pounding. You said this coat changed your life, but you changed mine, gave me back my name, my son, a roof, and hope. He opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, not flashy but shining quietly under the lights. I kept it in the pocket, he said, his voice trembling, because if there's anything more valuable than this coat, it's you. Clare stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. Clare Langston, will you marry me? A beat of stillness. Then she laughed, a soft, choked, beautiful sound, and nodded through her tears. Yes, of course. Yes. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, cheers and claps bouncing off the high glass ceiling. 1 month later, they were married. The wedding wasn't held in a grand ballroom or a five-star resort. It took place at Thomas's place, the little red brick community center that meant the world to them both. Children made paper flowers. The chairs didn't match. The cake was baked by one of the interns from Henry's mentorship program, but the room glowed with something money couldn't buy. Claire wore a simple white dress, her hair loose. Henry once again wore that same suit. Noah stood at his side as best man. The guests were volunteers, co-workers, people from shelters, and dozens of young employees who had once sat in Henry's tiny office, searching for purpose. During the vows, Claire held Henry's hands and looked into his eyes. "Once you gave me a coat," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Tonight, I give you my whole life." Her words fell over the room like sunlight through a stained glass window, soft, radiant, unforgettable. Henry couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks as the crowd around them dabbed at their eyes. Laughter followed. Music played. The reception spilled out into the courtyard where children ran barefoot and strings of fairy lights danced in the twilight. Someone snapped a photo. Henry and Claire stood beneath the sign of Thomas's place, side by side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. And beside them on an easel stood the old coat, silent, worn, and now immortalized. That image would go on to circulate online, shared, reposted, and talked about. A symbol not just of second chances, but of how something as simple as kindness could reach into the cold and rewrite everything. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a coat, a smile, a kind word, can echo further than we ever imagine. Henry didn't have much, but he gave what he could. And in return, he didn't just change Claire's life. He found love, purpose, and a new beginning. Their story reminds us all. Kindness doesn't require perfection. It just requires presence. Just heart. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that hope still lives in unexpected places, please like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here, we tell the tales that warm the heart, restore your faith in humanity, and remind us what truly matters. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing.